All right. So the second part, now we'll start really focusing in on cultivated meat. And now everyone should be hopefully aligned on the sort of terminologies, core technology areas, et cetera. And we can start to dive a little bit deeper into this technology. So the first question is really who's making it? And since the kind of dawn of the industry around 5 years ago or so, when the first companies were formed, we really seen a sort of explosion across the globe of new companies that have cropped up. And we're currently tracking around 40 or so different business to consumer companies that are making products that will eventually go into consumers' mouths. And with several others that are in stealth mode or have yet to raise significant capital. You can see a sort of snapshot of the geographic spread of these companies. This doesn't include all of them. This is from a paper that I recently co-authored that is, somewhat captures a lot of them, but, perhaps not all. And you can see that, the USA is the sort of leader in the hotspot in terms of the density of companies that are there, with many in Europe and other locales like Israel, and spreading across Asia as well. There are no B2C companies that exist yet in South America or Africa, to our knowledge, but there are B2B companies that have cropped up in South America. And we keep track of all these companies and update our company database that's at the top there, and we can share all these slides and the links to them after the presentation. So the next question is, what are they making? And many of the companies are really, their focus is on replacing traditional animal products. So anywhere from pork sausages to chicken nuggets or beef hamburgers, etc. A lot of these major products are currently being pursued, but there's room for many more. We've seen that the sort of geography and local cuisine seem to influence the product choice. So for instance, a new company, Val, that's based in Australia, has trialed producing kangaroo meat, whereas in China, or in Hong Kong, actually, there's a company called Avant Meats that's producing fish maw, which is a swim bladder of fish. Similarly, you can create products that are not just meat products, but serve different cuisines for different products themselves. So for instance, foie gras from companies based in France and Belgium, as well as companies that are focused on the production of pet food using, mouse as the actual species of interest. And then additionally, we have new companies like Turtle Tree Labs based in Singapore that are creating milk from the animal culture of animal cells. So really a wide spectrum of products that are beginning to emerge, and the business side of the business case here differs for each of them, where some companies are focused on providing solely, products for B2B ingredients. So fats, I think, is the sort of big category there, where you can probably create a product that has, 3 to 5% animal fat and yield a sort of animal fat flavor. And so that's an attractive market for early entrants. Early go-to-markets, early commercialization of those products, I should say. And there's no real technological limitation for these products. So, even though a company is working within, beef or chicken, these are really highly interchangeable in terms of the sort of process and underlying technology and biology that these companies will be developing in-house. So many of these companies are working in multiple different categories of food products or using different cell lines from different species. I think it's less certain that the interchangeability amongst seafood products between sort of terrestrial animals as the biology starts to spread out and becomes more different as you move downward along the evolutionary ladder. But nevertheless, there's a lot of overlap between the technologies that are being developed for a wide variety of products across the sector. So we've also, as I mentioned in the answer to one of the questions, is around these sort of emergence of B2B companies that are focused around these sort of 4 core technology areas. So for instance, in Argentina, we've seen a company called Cell Farm Foods that is making cell lines from breeds of Argentinian cattle that could kind of yield certain traits in the dish or in the bioreactor, let's say, that is unique to those cattle breeds. We've also seen a variety of companies that are pursuing different modes of bioreactors and bioprocess production that they hope to sell as a B2B component into this industry. Similarly, we've seen companies that are creating sort of whole formulated cell culture mediums or high value ingredients of those cell culture mediums like growth factors, as well as different companies that have cropped up that are creating scaffolding materials for the industry. And so, as kind of was alluded to in the last section, a lot of these companies are really being born out of, the birth of the cultivated meat industry, and I think aim to grow and evolve with the cultivated meat industry and maybe co-develop products with some of the B2C companies in the sector. But similarly, I think there's an open question around how many and to what extent will external players join them. So if we kind of spread this spectrum further along, across different sort of categories and into therapeutics, as well as plant-based meat companies, we've seen entrants along the spectrum playing a role in these sort of core technology areas. So for instance, Nova Meat is a company that's developing a 3D printed plant-based meat scaffold platform that they've recently announced that they want to translate that to produce scaffolds for the cultivated meat industry out of plants. Similarly, the mycelium-based bacon that I showed earlier, the same company is using that as scaffolding that they're selling to the cultivated meat companies. And we've seen this in other areas as well. BitBio, for instance, is a cell reprogramming company that generally services the drug discovery field, but their technology was actually licensed by a company called Meatable that allows them to reprogram their cell lines, more efficiently into fat and muscle. And then companies like Merck can really operate, with the extent of, all the products that they make and in-house expertise can really operate in all four of these different technology segments. So we've already seen these sort of external players that have joined this industry and kind of entering horizontally into the value chain at different points. And similarly, I think there's a whole host of variety of different external players. Again, this is just sort of examples of companies that, I think serve a good representation along this spectrum. But for instance, you have companies in the cell therapy space like Fate that have developed a sort of iPSC-based cell reprogramming and gene editing platform that could be adapted and ported into this industry. You have companies like Prellis Biologics making scaffolds for organ regeneration downstream, but their technologies could perhaps be used for scaffolding for this industry. You have large players like Evonik that have a very large fermentation infrastructure that can be used to supply amino acids or growth factors. And then other companies like Nutreco that are in the food and feed industry that can, kind of optimize those raw material supply chains and kind of import those into the cell culture medium that's used for the cultivated meat industry. So I think there are a variety and a wide diversity of other external players that will begin to kind of see the opportunity that they can use their technologies that they've developed and apply them to the cultivated meat industry. So I expect more and more sort of external entrants to start entering along that value chain that we talked about. And what's really the opportunity here? So what's at stake? This is a projection by A.T. Kearney, which is one of the most optimistic projections, at least for cultivated meat, which suggests that by 2040 it could make up 35% of the meat market. So 35% of 1.8 trillion is quite a lot of money, and even achieving 10% by 2030 will kind of return to that figure, but it's going to take a lot to get there. But obviously it's a large market to capture, and so a lot of people are paying attention to it. So the funding ecosystem thus far, you can see here, year over year, it's generally doubled or more year over year, and the entire industry now is supported by roughly let's say $340 million with excluding some deals that are not captured here. The makeup of the investor composition is, as Seth mentioned, is generally driven by venture capital, and we've seen more diversity happening across governments starting to play a role, family offices, and accelerators, incubators have always kind of been early funders of some of these companies as well. You can see here sort of the leaders in the investment space in terms of the amount of portfolio companies that they have. And these are generally mission-driven investors that kind of believe in the entire alternative protein sector as a whole and as a kind of change of force for the future of food. And so you see a lot of these same investors in the plant-based meat or fermentation sector as well. And all of this is captured at these resources again at the top if you want to check out more deeply the list. And we've also seen the number of countries, I should say, begin to increase as this industry grows. So, we frequently get contacted by investors from other countries that don't even have cultivated meat companies present in them that want to invest in cultivated meat companies in other countries just because they believe in the technology and they want to see it grow. So you can see the breakdown by region is somewhat interesting to look at. California still dominates. There's a kind of hotspot of companies that exist in the Bay Area and one in San Diego. And this is followed by Israel, which is another hotspot, and other areas in Europe. And I'll mention that, we're giving a free webinar that goes more in depth into the sort of state of the industry report that we released last week. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you're interested in learning more about the sort of investment side of things. So in addition to the sort of venture capital that has played a critical role, we're seeing more strategic investors and large partnerships that I think will be critical for growth. So not only have some of the largest meat manufacturers like Tyson, Cargill, and PHW Group invested in plant-based meat companies, but they've also invested in a variety of cultivated meat companies. And so they kind of have the in-house expertise of meat science, as well as maybe the future distribution channels. They have the brands, they have customer trust in many cases that will help these companies, I think, come to market and grow. Additionally, we see large life science companies like Merck and their venture arm has invested in Mosameat, as well as they've taken, I think, 2 separate cultivated meat companies into their own accelerator program. And so being able to leverage that sort of in-house expertise that Merck has across those sort of key technology value chains, I think will be really beneficial for those companies. And so we expect, I think, more large life science companies to pay more attention to this industry in a similar way that Merck has jumped in somewhat early. So to give you a sense of the sort of additional evolving ecosystem around cultivated meat research and development, we've begun to see different forms of government support across the last 2 years or so. So for instance, the Indian government has invested $640,000 into a research center based in Mumbai that has some work already started in cultivated meat research. Singapore is another country that has invested quite heavily into food tech in general, as well as paid particular interest with cultivated meat, where they have their own funding program that will be closing soon, and they'll be announcing sort of awards for certain projects there. But a lot of money is focused strictly on cultivated meat and sort of food safety as it pertains to cultivated meat, which has been somewhat unique thus far. We've seen Japan and their Science and Technology Agency earmark $20 million for cultivated meat projects, as well as invest an undisclosed amount in the only Japanese company there called Agriculture. And a pretty interesting collaboration between industry and academia and the cultivated meat company Piece of Meat in Belgium to create, cultivated foie gras. And then finally, the EU Commission has invested in several different European-based cultivated meat companies, and I think has been fairly supportive of alternative proteins, more broadly speaking. So if you look outside of the actual industry and in these startups in academia, there's been a really uptick in the amount of different projects going on that I think will play a crucial role in driving some of the taking the burden off of the sort of in-house innovation that's needed or that's going on at cultivated meat companies. We've additionally assisted one major U.S. university and are helping, in discussions with several more with this idea around establishing permanent research centers of excellence that we think will be key in driving early innovation that can translate into new technologies for this industry. And our GF Ideas community, which generally focused around kind of fostering entrepreneurship, was expanded into encompassing a community of scientists. And we've seen in just 2 months, we've welcomed over 550 scientists from 38 different countries and launched a seminar series, which I encourage you all to attend if you're interested. And we also have a free online course that has grown in participation, especially in light of the coronavirus situation. And we're tracking a variety of different courses that are springing up at US institutions and more institutions globally. And we hope to port some of those course materials into a sort of open access repository where new courses can be formed more easily. So we've additionally launched a crowdsourced database that tracks tools, protocols, reagents, and different service providers in the cultivated meat space. So we're asking companies and people in academia to basically crowdsource all of that data that we are kind of screening and putting into one commonly used resource that hopefully will fuel a lot of, or take the burden off of early researchers that, you know, for some of these cell lines and species that they work with, it's hard to find the right tools or protocols for. We've also launched a global database for funding opportunities that are screened for relevance to cultivated meat. And then also last year, the Cultivated Meat Modeling Consortium launched with multiple partners. I sit on the working group from GFI's perspective, along with several others in the consortium. And the goal is really to leverage computer modeling to speed up and accelerate the sort of, you know, innovation that you can't really have when you're in the lab. So the costs and the timelines are just prohibitive to really doing iterative research. And computer modeling can really speed things along. And so I'm really excited about some of the projects that are ongoing there that will be released in the next 2 months. And then finally, we have a variety of different resources for students that want to get more involved in the cultivated meat and alternative protein sector more broadly. I wanted to give people a snapshot of the current regulatory environment for cultivated meats. In the US, at least, the USDA and FDA have agreed to jointly regulate the product. So the FDA oversees the collection of the initial animal tissue biopsy all the way up until the point of harvest, at which point it's turned over to the USDA, which regulates the packaging and labeling of the product. So there's somewhat still ambiguity around, you know, what this actual transition looks like. And so we hope that further details will be released sometime later this year. Nevertheless, Asian jurisdictions like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan seem to be perhaps the most promising pathways to market due to the local government support. Where, you know, these countries generally import a lot of their food, and so they view this as a sort of workaround to future food security problems, where they can actually produce meat on their own land without having to import it in the future. In the European Union, products are covered by the Novel Food Regulation, and approval process there could take anywhere from 1.5 to 2 years. And so while some companies are targeting the European market, in general, this is, you know, I think of secondary order for kind of the go-to market process for a lot of these companies, mainly due to that extensive timeline. And then in Australia and New Zealand, they've stated that the new products would fall under existing frameworks that they have in their food standards code and require a pre-market approval process. So there's still work to do in carving a path to fair regulation to get these products onto the market. In 2019, last year, there were 5 cultivated meat companies that formed an alliance that, you know, sought to advocate for regulatory clarity and educate consumers about these products. But to date, I'm not sure exactly how much work has been done or how many inroads they've made with regulators across different jurisdictions. To that end, one of the projects that we're working on is to establish a sort of safety dossier that hopes to sort of gain a consensus bioprocess that we can present to regulators and companies that maps out all of the sort of safety consideration and testing suggestions or recommendations along the bioprocess, so that we can kind of create consensus such that for these products to come onto market in different areas, they don't have to jump through different hoops from different frameworks. So we really hope to kind of smoothen the path to market across different geographies and countries by allowing regulators to adopt a framework that's kind of a consensus amongst the industry players. And then finally, in the USA and elsewhere, there are some bills that that restrict the labeling of different alternative meat products. And some of these actually extend to cultivated meat products, even though they're not on the market, saying that if they were on the market, they would require qualifiers like lab grown or grown in the lab, which obviously is not so consumer friendly. And so we lobby against that. One of the other questions to give a snapshot of sort of the state of the industry is the question around sustainability and the life cycle assessments that have been performed to date. So just to summarize the life cycle assessments, when compared to US beef production, in general, you find an enormous reduction in the amount of land that's required, the emissions that are used, as well as the nutrient pollution. And that is generally consistent across the variety of studies that have been done to date. Nutrient pollution is generally eutrophication of waterways, which generally involves the sort of, in conventional ag involves the runoff of nutrients from farms due to manure, et cetera, that pollutes the waterways. So obviously I think that is something that will be greatly reduced with cultivated meat or no animals involved in the process. So energy and water use, at least, are less certain, and the sort of level of uncertainty there is quite high because these processes don't really exist at scale, and so they're harder to predict. I think one of the big questions is really, is all of this, we know it's going to be somewhat energy intensive, but really we can offset that by the incorporation of renewable energy. So it's really a matter of how much of a role that's going to play in the future as this industry grows, and facilities are hopefully planned with that in mind. So to answer, some of the uncertainty around these questions, we have an ongoing study in collaboration with over 13 companies, of which about half of them are actual cultivated meat companies, to provide a more rigorous assessment that is due probably, at least by the end of this year to be finalized in terms of the results, as well as a techno-economic analysis that accompanies all of this. So really trying to highlight and pinpoint the economic bottlenecks that lie throughout the bioprocess that these companies are establishing, scaled up to 10,000, or scaled out to a future commercial scale facility that's producing, let's say, 10,000 metric tons of meat per year. So to summarize this section, the cultivated meat industry is rapidly growing, and that's seen a lot of companies that have been found and a lot of excitement amongst investors. So far to date, it's been highly vertically integrated, but I think fresh influxes of these B2B companies that grow with the industry internally, as well as external entrants to the industry will help to drive innovation and accelerate this technology. And we're starting to see this sort of more robust R&D ecosystem that's developing. However, we need a lot more public dollars, I think, to support this growth.